I'm waiting for a thumbs up, sorry. Hello everyone. Welcome to our second speaker event of term, our first one in Cambridge. And it's our pleasure as a society to welcome Jack Anderton. Now, Jack Anderton, 25 years old, a graduate of KCL, is largely credited as helping Nigel Farage's TikTok reach unprecedented levels. He has also worked on successful reform campaigns such as Luke Campbell's successful mayoral bid for Hull and East Yorkshire. And a lot of his videos have gone very viral on TikTok. I remember very young, when I was 17 years old or 18, seeing some of his videos. So this is a very exciting event. And please do give a warm welcome to Mr. Jack Anderton.
Thank you, Oscar, for that introduction. I'm just going to quickly get my notes up here so I can follow what I'm going to say to you all today. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for coming. I appreciate it's not always the nicest to have to walk through a protest outside of an event. I think the protest was pretty feeble. It was about 15 people. Pretty feeble, 15 people calling me a racist, which is always a pleasant thing to have happen. Welcome to those people watching on the live streams. This is a new thing that we've started doing from this year. So obviously the tour is called a New Dawn Tour, and we've already done 4 events. And it was inspired really by Charlie Kirk's campus tours. And it was something I'd wanted to do for a while, actually. I'd been thinking about it for many years, and when obviously he was, sadly assassinated in America, it sort of spurred me on, and I just thought that I was going to sort of do it now because there's no better time. So I decided to launch my tour. The first stop was in Durham, which went swimmingly. There were no protests. It was really calm, actually. The second stop was at York University, in which I had 400 people come out to protest me. Now, I had an 8-man police escort at the York University, so it was quite surreal for me, really, as someone who, let's be honest, is quite minuscule. To have 400 people come out and protest me was insane, actually. Let's be honest about it, it was insane. So that was York. Then the third was Edinburgh. Now, I'm not really sure you can count Edinburgh as the third stop because we had 3 venues cancel. So the first, we had the university cancel. They decided not to platform me. The second was a community hall that had previously had Jeremy Corbyn speak just a couple of years earlier, and they decided that they didn't want Jack Anderton speaking. So they cancelled that booking. And then the third was a bar in Edinburgh city centre, to which the protesters showed up right outside of the door and were calling attendees racist and fascist. So unfortunately, Edinburgh didn't go as successfully as we maybe would have wanted, but the good news is we're going back in February, so in a couple of weeks' time, and we're going to do it proper and prim, hopefully. Hopefully it won't get cancelled. Then the fourth was Exeter, in which we had protesters banging on the window. Again, calling me a fascist and a racist. So that was fun. And today, obviously, Cambridge is my 5th stop. And the tour this year, I think, has been elevated. So you can see, we're live streaming it. And it's really to reach as big of an audience as possible. So I think we've probably got about 40, 50 people in here today, which is great. But ultimately, the best form to reach people is online. I've learned that during my sort of short career so far, working for Nigel and with Reform. Social media is almost like a magic source to reach people, and that's partly why we're live streaming today. So a little bit about the protests outside is many of the students outside and many of the people protesting share a lot of my concerns. They're concerned about their country, they're concerned about the cost of housing, they're concerned about the cost of living, they're concerned about whether they will have ample and good job opportunities. So a lot of the people that have protested the events share a lot of my concerns. And so many of them are just simply misguided, and a small few are acting in bad faith and are actually quite evil people at times in their rhetoric and how they behave. But a little bit about the tour and why I decided to call it sort of a new dawn. And to me, Britain is at a crossroads. Over the next couple of years, we will essentially as a people and as a country determine the direction of our country. And for me, and I think for most of the people in this room and across the country, I think it's about 2/3 if you look at the polling, they believe that Britain is headed in the wrong direction. Now, where we disagree perhaps is what direction we should take it in. So there are multiple paths ahead. I will try and outline and set out my path and my vision that I think the country should follow. But there are many other paths. There's people who support the Green Party's path, there's the Labour Party path, the Conservative Party path, or another path totally different than that. But what is achievable is a new dawn. Britain can change, and it will change. And for me, it's about which path we take, and that's partly why I'm here today. And my aim is to convince you that my path is the right path, and perhaps the path that many of you believe in. And the path forward for me, it's low immigration, essentially zero immigration actually. It's mass house building so that people can have affordable homes and they're not paying extortionate rent. It is a meritocratic country in which the best and the brightest can be elevated to the top. It is prosperity and rising wages and well-paying jobs. It is being tough on crime and tough on lawlessness. Crime is at record levels across the country. And it's also about embracing technology and embracing the future. There's no reason why, for example, Britain can't have a moon base. Why can't we have that? There is no reason why Britain cannot be at the frontier of technology. And none of this is particularly radical. Britain's decline is real, but it's also reversible. We can look at what other countries have done. And actually, if we go back in our history, Britain was once the greatest country in the world. Now, that's not a harp to the past. That is just a harp to what we were and what we could be. But for me in this speech today, there is sort of one big lie and one falsehood that blocks progress and that potentially blocks this path. And it's to do with immigration. And it's the falsehood that extreme immigration has been a net positive for the country. Now, much has been discussed about the sort of social and cultural aspects of immigration, but my main focus today, and speaking to students here and young people online, is the economic impact that immigration has had on young people, especially young people. And I really want to start talking about housing. So housing is unaffordable for almost everyone unless you're rich. But housing is especially unaffordable for young people, not just in the big cities, but across the country as well. Rents are at record highs nationwide. In London, I think the average rent is about $2,500 a month. It's insane, and we wonder why people are in flat shares and HMOs and things like that. But many of you will be thinking, well, Jack, that's simply because we haven't built enough homes. And you're absolutely correct, we haven't. The Centre for Policy Studies estimates that we have a 6.5 million home shortage. Now, that's huge. And if you look at the Labour Party's target for house building, they want to build 300,000 a year. They're currently on track to build only about 200,000 a year. And to build 6.5 million homes is going to take about 22 years. So you're potentially seeing 22 years of even higher rent and even higher house prices. So what we need to take into account with housing and house building is that for the past sort of decade, and I believe since 2001, migration has accounted for about 98% of our population growth. And what that means is that planning then becomes impossible because it's hard to estimate how many people are coming in to the country. And it's simple economics, it's simple supply and demand. If you are building 200,000 homes a year, yet, for example, last year you're letting in 900,000 people, there simply isn't enough housing to go around. Again, it's simple supply and demand, but it's not just happening, in the urban areas, although it is. The worst hit are probably, here, Cambridge, Oxford, London especially, where many people are spending over half their income on rent, and especially young people and young graduates. Now, if we look at a study that was submitted by a think tank a couple of months ago, it came out, which is that migration since the early 2000s has added about £132 a month to your rent if you live outside of London. So that's £1,600 a year. If you live in London, it's added about £216 a month. So that's £2,600 a year extra that you are spending on rent because of mass migration into the country. And the result, as we've just said, is house shares and HMOs becoming normal, which is that young people who have perfectly respectable, perfectly well-paying jobs are often living in houses sharing with 4 people. Now, it doesn't need to be that way. That is not an inevitable situation. But it's not just housing, it's also affected jobs and wages. So if we look at wage suppression, for example, again, if you let in 900,000 migrants into the country last year, yet you only have 700,000 vacancies, you are allowing employers to hold the leverage, which means wages stagnate because employers, thanks to the government, have been provided a huge supply of workers from lower wage, lower skilled countries. So employers inevitably choose cheaper labor over higher pay for British people. And another aspect of immigration that people don't really talk about is that the student job is dying. You know, I look at people that I know who are students who have struggled to find employment. And it's purely because why hire an 18-year-old student who's part-time, who you've got to work around his student schedule, his studying schedule, when you could hire a full-time migrant worker? For an employer, it doesn't make sense. So the student job is dying for a lot of younger people. But it's also affecting our technology and our productivity advancement. So Britain is falling behind advanced economies across the world because we've chosen cheap labor over innovation and over the future. So a couple of quick stats for you. Britain, I'll come on to why I'm talking about robots in a second, but Britain has 112 robots per 10,000 workers. If you look at South Korea, they have about 1,000 per 10,000 workers. South Korea took just 75,000 migrants last year. What we are seeing is that cheap labor has delayed automation. It has delayed embracing those robotics and future technologies. And it keeps wages low and it keeps growth low. And employers love it. So what is the solution? Well, the solution, in my mind, is to reduce immigration to essentially zero. We only need migrants when absolutely necessary. And that will then spur on and essentially force investment in automation, in productivity, and technology. Now, this is achievable. It is perfectly legitimate. Other countries follow this path. And our prosperity and our wealth, actually, is dependent on killing this sort of myth that mass immigration has been a good thing for Britain. So that's the sort of sum up of what I want to talk about today, and I'm sure people will have questions, and Oscar will have questions as well. But I want to sort of talk a little bit about politics in general, and how people always ask me, how can I get involved, how can I help? And what I would say is this tour, for example, is a great sort of vision of, I know it's a bit cringe, but of just doing things. I just woke up one morning and decided, I was going to do this university tour, and so far it's proven to be quite successful, and it's had a lot of engagement. So literally, if you want to get involved in politics, just get up and do what you want to do, because most people aren't acting, most people aren't doing anything, they're sat at home. So if you want to see change of the country, whether that's my change or your change or whatever it is, get involved. And one of the ways you can get involved is by joining a political party. I'm biased as to what political party you should join. It's obviously Reform, but you're free to join the other failing parties if you choose so. But events like this as well are also really important. They build momentum, they build networks, so people meet like-minded people, and they also help to shift the culture, because I speak to a lot of students who actually find that they would love to speak to politically aligned people on campus, but they find it really hard to find people who think like them. So these events are actually perfect for that. And it helps with the sort of social ostracization of a lot of the students that happens on campus. So for example, I was at York University, and one of the students was telling me how when he joined the Reform Society, his sort of flatmates in his dorm, as a sort of way to bully him essentially, bought a block of cheese from a supermarket and melted it on his doorknob, which I thought was slightly bizarre. But these events are super important to actually meet like-minded people, because most of the people, I mean, I think everyone is probably in broad agreement that Britain is in a period of decline. You know, things are not going well. Living standards are falling. The average Brit is poorer, about a third poorer than the average American. You know, 1 in 4 graduate jobs pay minimum wage. You know, crime is rising, as I said. NHS is broken, and you know, we've got record high rents and the highest energy costs in the world. So things are not going well for our country at the minute. And you know, back to sort of party politics, which is that Labour and the Conservative Party have caused this. They've caused our national decline. And as part of this tour and as part of a new dawn and a new horizon for Britain, my mission over the next couple of years is to channel the sort of country's anger, or at least help to channel the country's anger into what I perceive as radical change. You know, people are desperate for a political revolution. You saw this all the way back in 2016 with Brexit, and that anger has not dissipated. It hasn't gone away. It's now been simply channeled into the Reform Party, into the Green Party, for example. Again, obviously I'm biased. You absolutely should join the Reform Party. But my mission over the next sort of 2-3 years is to help to reverse this national decline, and really to sum up my view is to make Britain wealthier and stronger and a greater country to live in. So I said I'd keep the speech short because the questions are always more interesting. So I'm going to invite Oscar back on stage to do some questions.
Is this working? Okay, good. So I will start with some of my own questions using my chairman's privilege, and then we'll move to audience questions. Just a few things about audience questions. Unlike usual speaker events, we're actually going to get people to sort of walk up to that mic there and ask a question. So when we move over to audience questions, if you want to ask a question, line up behind that mic, and we'll do that sort of thing one at a time. My first question is, and it's sort of the obvious one, this is the Conservative Association. You're obviously a big supporter of reform. You spoke previously before about why you think it should be reform over the Tories because of the past 14 years of failure. Is that the only reason, or are there any further reasons why, say, you think reform are preferable to the Tories?
Well, to me, as I sort of expressed in the speech, is that, you know, you've got two parties, Labour and the Conservatives, who have had decades now to fix our country, and all they've done consistently is break it. You know, they haven't created opportunities, they haven't made us wealthier, they haven't made us greater, they've diminished our standing, not just globally, but domestically as well. So to me, why would I support two parties who have destroyed my country? It's pretty simple. They have destroyed the country. And why would I then reward them with my vote at any future election? And why I am backing reform, and why I'm not sort of, you know, non-party political or even supporting, you know, a different party like the Green or something else, is that I know that Nigel Farage would make a fantastic Prime Minister. You know, I've known him for a couple of years now. I believe in him as a person. I believe in his vision. And I think he is the man for the job. And that's really what distinguishes, I think, the Conservatives and Labour with Nigel, which is that reform has a leader that you can envision as being the leader of our country. You know, if you look at Keir Starmer, he's sort of a used car salesman. If you look at Kemi Badenoch, I mean, I wouldn't even want to say what she looks like. But, you know, Nigel Farage is the Prime Minister that Britain needs and Britain wants. And that's really why I'm backing reform.
So the arguments about sort of like Kemi Badenoch fixing the party just don't convince you?
You can't fix something that is systemically broken. all of their best MPs, in my mind, have now left. You've had the Robert Jenrick defection, you've had the Suella defection. So all of their sort of right-wing MPs, per se, have left the party. So now you've sort of got a mix of total failures, of total sort of non-entities, and people who were responsible over the last 14 years of breaking the country. So it's a question really of trust and whether you can trust them. I personally can't trust people that have just spent 14 years destroying my country.
Fine. I'll ask one more. I'll ask one more, and then we'll move to the microphone over there. You spoke a lot about housing, and obviously it's true that immigration has contributed a lot to this housing crisis. But how much of it do you reckon is also, say, terrible regulation over the past, 80 years, quite frankly, but more recently? How much of the housing crisis is caused by regulation and economic mismanagement rather than immigration?
So I think it's a huge part of it, yes, and that's sort of what I alluded to in the speech, which is that we need to have a sort of mass house building program. I'm sure that the Town and Country Planning Act isn't popular amongst people sat here, but there is a program that needs to be initiated of a sort of mass house building, and that doesn't mean just concrete over the green belt, of course not. But what it does mean is that we need to make it easier to build. We need to make it easier to, even for people to build like extensions on their house. Why does it take months and months, even years, to get planning permission to build an extension on your own home? It's a question of how can we make it as easy as possible for people to build things that are necessary and things that people want.
Sure. On that note, I think we'll move to questions. So if anyone has a question, please do move to the mic there and...
Is that working now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much.
I think just wait for people to line up and then...
Yeah. Of course, now my phone has gone blank as I was about to read my question. So I'm not conservative, but I was a student here 50 years ago, just a first comment before I ask my question. And there used to be demonstrations, but there was never a cancel culture. We would demonstrate that we didn't agree with the person, but we wouldn't try to stop them speaking. And I think that's a quite extraordinary cultural change which has taken place. My first question is on decline. You analyse the decline as largely related to migration, except that if we look at a wider picture of civilizational decline, for instance, if you look at Roman Empire or Mongols or even Chinese dynasties, there seems to be this common factor of a rising bureaucracy where everybody becomes, and I can see this in my lifetime, thousands of really clever people employed doing, your point about the planning regulations, but all these university degrees which are worth nothing, the lawyers who are stopping the deportations or holding up the family court. So that's my first question is, do you not think that bureaucracy is a primary driver of decline? And my second point is specifically about housing. Although you're right in saying that migration will tip the balance, the big difference to me is the way in which mortgages are offered. That is, when I was young, you could borrow 3 times your income and you had to save 10% and what have you. And that held prices down. But under Mrs. Thatcher and also Ronald Reagan, there was a deregulation, which didn't seem to have an effect for a few decades, but at the beginning of this century, suddenly you start to get this amplification of the price. And it hasn't just happened here. It's happened in Shanghai. It's happened everywhere. House prices have become totally unreasonable, and it's largely to do with land values rather than the cost. So 2 questions. What do you think about the bureaucracy question? The second one is the banking rules connected with the price of housing?
Well, I actually think that your 2 questions are broadly connected, actually, which is, yes, bureaucracy is a huge problem and it is a huge cause of decline. It makes it harder to to my point in the speech, to actually do things and actually make things happen. And partly that's been impacted on housing, which means it's so difficult to actually not just build housing, but build anything really. And in terms of your second question, again, I'm not super familiar about the sort of banking regulations that were deregulated. But what I would say is that you can link them. So yes, it's San Francisco, yes, it's Shanghai, but what has happened in all of those locations, I think, that you mentioned, which is that it has become harder to build things. And yes, it is about land, but it's also about utilizing the space that is already built up. So for example, in London, why aren't we building on top of, for example, tube stations? That's a perfectly legitimate use of land, and it's just not being utilized. So I think it's your questions are both entirely linked.
Go
ahead. Hello, thank you for your talk. So you talk a lot about sort of the resource loss to the average Brit as a result of immigration, in the housing, student jobs you mentioned, why hire an intermittent student when you could hire an immigrant? And do you not think you're sort of committing the same sort of cardinal sin that the net zero lobby commit, which is to see everything as zero sum? Do you not think that actually, if you want to increase the availability of jobs and sort of low-paid, unskilled jobs for students, the way to do that isn't to sort of stem the flow of immigrants and sort of deport people, and maybe we can do that at a rate quicker than high street businesses fold? Do you not think it's actually that we can increase the number of jobs at a rate faster than whatever the trickle of immigrants is at the end as regulations take hold in that field? And actually, by stripping back anti-business regulation, really there is more to go around than would require us to squabble over the scraps.
Well, I don't think it's a question of squabbling over scraps. But I would throw the question back to you, which is, what is your solution to increase a huge number of jobs?
Well, I would scrap the... Well, I would... Well, you need to take a sort of grab hold of the state. You need to scrap the Climate Change Act, scrap the Equalities Act, scrap the Human Rights Act. You need to go in and you need to take out all of this stuff which is sort of throttling business and preventing things from getting done. And you need to make the UK as business-friendly a place as possible. That should be your priority.
So I don't disagree with a lot of that, but I do question whether that would have the impact that you stated. In terms of sort of student jobs, I don't think that would have a particularly huge impact. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs. We're not just talking about tens of thousands. So whilst, yes, I agree with some of your proposals, I'm not sure that would go the full way.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for your speech. My name's Maeve Halligan, and I set up and co-founded and now run the Cambridge University Society of Women. And sure, we're not a party political organisation, but we are the only, to my knowledge, single-sex society for women at this university, and to be honest, again, to my knowledge, in Britain at a university. And what's interesting about that is that we're often, well, and me personally, are dubbed, right-leaning on that basis, which is interesting in itself. But what I have found within our rapidly growing membership is not only is there appetite for that kind of society, and it's in part because it's a single-sex space, but it's also because one of the central missions of the society is to encourage free speech. Now, part of how we do that is by having a women's-only society, but it's partly through making sure that, opinions are tolerated, if not respected, and spoken to, civilly, and disagreement is civil and arguably encouraged. But, I don't think anybody in this room would disagree that free speech is definitely in crisis at a lot of UK universities and more broadly. But I guess so the creation of the society is needed, but it's also justified on that basis. And what's interesting is that in that environment of free speech, a lot of the women there speak to how they don't necessarily feel that they even, in the first place, have a right to form their view in their own mind before they voice it to other people, kind of from of an even playing field, if you like. I look around in this room and it's vast majority men, and I would want to ask firstly, what attendance has been like at your other talks so far in terms of the male-female split. And I think maybe I'd wager that it's majority men most of the time. And I think part of why...
That's correct, yeah.
Sure. And I think, and it's not to disparage you or what you're doing or reform, but I think part of why that is because women especially empathy and emotion is so tied to what your views are sort of permitted to be. So I would ask you what you think about that sort of generally, but also what you think about how, you know, universities, I suppose specifically, should create and, you know, to an extent enforce an environment of real free speech for everybody, because I think a lot of women suffer under this understanding, call it internalized, I guess it's learnt really, this understanding that their political views are things that are directly tied to their moral values. So just briefly for reference, you know, the way that I've been treated by students who I've never met, who don't know me, I'm quite new at this university, you know, they dub me not only as incorrect, but as morally bad, as morally abhorrent on the basis of my views. And I think that is something that does affect women a lot more than it affects men. And I know that there are women who, you know, forget supporting reform, who theoretically support, you know, the Conservative Party, let alone the Conservative Association here. And I just wonder what you have to say about how women can feel more facilitated to voice their views, whatever they may be, because now it's not so much that they're suffering to, that they can't necessarily voice views if they're right-wing, it's that they struggle to feel they can voice a view at all because it's so tied to their sort of moral value and their sense of that. Thanks.
So I think they're all perfectly valid points, but what I would say is people don't necessarily have to voice their views and opinions. I'm never one to sort of force people or push people to voice their political opinions if they don't want to and if they don't wish to. I think we have to be conscious of the fact that not everybody wants to be political either. On the topic of women and what you're doing here, I have read about it, and I think everyone's probably read about it. And what I would say is, in terms of a sort of free speech situation at university campuses, I think again partly events like this, and it's actually one of the only things that your party or the Conservative Party have done well in the sort of last 14 years, which was the Higher Education Free Speech Bill. Which essentially means that universities have to allow events, as long as they're properly and thoroughly sort of thought through and regulated. They have to allow events to take place. So that's really been the one thing that the Conservative Party have done in the last 14 years that was decent and good. And it's purely just about opening up the debate and the conversation to as many people as possible. But also getting people to actually attend as well. So, you know, I was in Cambridge last year for the Charlie Kirk debate, and I would say actually that was an even mix between men and women, and maybe that says something about his audience or his sort of controversial viewpoints. But it is a challenge, I think, especially on the right, to bring women in, especially younger women. I'm not really sure how we fix that, to be quite honest with you. I'd be interested to hear on your thoughts on that. But it's definitely something that I'm conscious of, and something that I'm willing to learn about.
Any further?
Evening. You mentioned, I think, at the beginning, unless I misheard, that ideally you'd like zero immigration. I'm guessing you don't mean literally. Perhaps you'd accept billionaires who would provide an awful lot to this country compared to what they take out. And maybe you'd allow millionaires to come in, and then maybe you'd allow people on six-figure salaries. I wonder where you draw the line
Well, I think that the line for me is it's probably sort of essentially zero immigration, so probably less than 20,000 people a year, and it's what they can bring to the country. Yeah, perhaps maybe they are a billionaire, or perhaps they have a specific expertise or skill set that we as a country absolutely require, but in general we should try and have domestic expertise and domestic skills.
So your answer there was interesting, because you essentially said what Boris Johnson said, and he created the Boris wave, which is allow people.
I'm not Boris Johnson.
but your wording there was, if we need them, then they can come. But that's very vague, because you can say, well, we're short on nurses, so we need nurses. We're short on social care. Let's bring in social care. They won't come unless they bring the family. Okay, let's bring their family. So I'm really interested in like a solid sort of. If you're this person, you are the marginal person where I will not accept. I recognise that you can add value to the country, but you will not be in your perfect view of how immigration is dealt with in Britain. that person is rejected.
So I think it's difficult to go case by case, but you mentioned too social workers and nurses. We should come to a situation in the country where we're not importing any social workers or nurses, and that they're purely domestically trained.
Yeah, but again, that's quite vague because...
It's not vague. I've just told you. We shouldn't allow social workers and nurses in as long as we have enough that are domestically trained. If we do that overnight, then that's going to cause problems, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But the goal should be to get to the point where we do not have to let or allow migrants that are social workers and nurses.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Sorry if I'm taking over. Tell me to shut up.
Yeah, you can ask one more.
Yeah, one more. Yeah. So you mentioned until we can produce enough locally, it's fine to have that immigration.
It's not fine, but it's just a necessity.
Yeah. So you agree on it, but I'm thinking that is something that will take quite a while. You can't train nurses even in a few years. Start with grassroots, and say reform gets into government in 2029, and they've been saying, we want zero immigration, but they follow your logic of, well, we need to wait until we do this stuff. 4 years goes by, 5 years goes by, immigration is exactly the same because we haven't reached the point yet where we can say no to social workers, etc.
Well, I don't think immigration would stay exactly the same. I think you'd see a drastic drop if reform came to power. But the immigration policy, in terms of what you're discussing, would obviously be in terms of nurses and social workers an ambition. The NHS, quite frankly, and our healthcare system, if we just immediately, up the borders and didn't allow people in, it would not go well for many people in this country. So it's about what's necessary, and it's about moving towards a place where actually we can have zero immigration.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't trust ONS estimations on immigration statistics.
Hi, Jack. Just to come back to that point very briefly, one of the things that's massaging that figure is the high level of net immigration of very talented young people, high graduates to other countries. So actually, the migration figure is slightly dropped, but actually it's because young people are leaving the country. You ask about what women can do to vote reform. I have been very lucky to have given political representation and helped connect women who have been in prison with politicians to talk about the fact that they've been locked up with men. They've been in showers with men. They've been in cells with men. And a lot of these women feel very vulnerable. A lot of these women feel the constant pressure of sexual assault. A lot of these women are assaulted. And the state doesn't care. Now, one of the problems I think women have consistently voiced to me about reform is that reform don't have a clear, coherent strategy on women's spaces. Now, I know that obviously you've had problems with Vanessa Frakes, who was the Justice Advisor. She came out and said, well, case-by-case basis, that was rolled back. Nigel said that's not party policy. And Widdicombe then came out and said, well, case-by-case basis. Nigel said it's not party policy. But there are 29 elected reform members who are saying it should be on a case-by-case basis. My question really to you is, if you want women to trust you on the basis of that you will keep men, particularly violent men, and I've seen some of these violent men. I've stood face-to-face with Katie Dolotowski in Scotland, who was a convicted paedophile who tried to rape and murder the nurse treating him in prison with a needle that was stuck in his arm. How are Reform going to make out a clear message, and Nigel going to put out a clear message that Reform stand for not a single penis in a women's prison?
Thank you for the question. What I would say is, obviously, Nigel Farage is the leader of Reform, so what he says goes, and he's been very clear that women's spaces should be protected, and he was very clear at the time about having women separate in prisons from men. So I think he has been clear on that, and obviously his again, what he says goes on that policy issue. I can't sit here and obviously create a policy proposal for you. That's not my bag. But what I can say is Nigel is, of course, concerned about the safety and protection of women in single-sex spaces, and he will continue to be so.
Just to come back very briefly on that, and when I've dealt with Nigel and asked him questions, and one of the questions I asked him was about the GRA. So for those who aren't aware, there's the Gender Recognition Act. It's the mechanism that allows men to become women in law, and it essentially creates that ability for men to enter women's spaces. It is a creation of a judgment in the European courts, and that judgment essentially rendered it that you had to provide some sort of legal mechanism. So Nigel wants to leave the EHRC. I completely agree with that. I think it's completely ridiculous. I know you've spoken very well about that. But when I've asked Nigel about wanting to repeal the GRA, the mechanism that allows men to gain that legal status, Nigel prevaricates. Nigel doesn't have a clear answer. So all I would want to know from you is, I mean, I know you can't answer for Nigel, and I wouldn't expect you to, is would you support repealing the mechanism that allows men to be women in law in this country and therefore solve all the problems of access to spaces, because we simply repeal a law which, and I'll tell people now, the law was actually created from a judgment that said that if you are penetrated, you are inherently female. So it's a homophobic judgment from the starter, which probably will resonate with anyone who's gay, but also anyone who's a woman in the room as well, because it called women the submissive sex in the judgment text. So I wonder what you would think about repealing a mechanism that allows that transformation.
I mean, from what you've described, I would support repealing it, yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I just want to ask about practical application of what you're saying. So I guess when we look at kind of mass migration, kind of legally, yes, you can shut it off, you can deny visas, etc. But we also have a mass influx of illegal migration coming across the border, and there's also, per what you're saying, a large proportion of illegal migrants or migrants who've already settled. To implement the policy you're suggesting, you'd have to run something similar to ICE in the United States. And given the amount of kind of fear and hostility and kind of outright violence that's happened as a result of ISIS policies and the aggressive handling of the Trump administration, who Farage has been kind of incredibly complimentary of, which have obviously led to the two tragic murders in Minnesota of Nicole Good and Alex Pretty, do you not worry that, I suppose, by pursuing a policy which kind of makes targeting immigrants and deporting immigrants focal point, you risk alienating, I guess, a large percentage of the voter base on potentially humanitarian grounds?
Well, ICE is targeting primarily, almost solely, illegal migrants.
But neither of the two people who were killed in Minnesota were.
Well, I didn't say they were, but they're primarily targeting illegal migrants in America. So, to be quite honest with you, if you are here illegally, you have broken our law, and you should be treated as a criminal because you are a criminal. So, in our own sort of British way, because I think our justice system and our police system is, by virtue, just sort of calmer and less abrasive than Americans. If you are here illegally, you are a criminal and you must be deported. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate and reasonable viewpoint that millions and millions of people across the country share.
But how do you practically go about applying that? So it's one thing to say, yes, we're going to deport these people. Yes, we're going to, set up an institution which goes about making sure that they're no longer present in the country, that they're no longer gaining access to the borders. But actually, you've seen kind of violence emerging on the borders in some countries, particularly along the Mediterranean, of immigrants kind of coming up and dealing with kind of border enforcement agencies. I guess how do you practically counter that? Because what we've done is we've presented a very valid problem, but you don't have a kind of an applicable solution.
Well, in the context of the people crossing the channel, we know who those people are because they're registered and they're identified within the Home Office, and a lot of your taxes pay for their hotels and their housing. So we know where a lot of those people are, and in any future government they could quite simply be taken on a coach to an airport and then deported to wherever. In terms of the wider sort of 1.2 million illegals that are here, again, that's more difficult, which I think is what your question is referencing more. And to me, what you would do is you would try and identify the industries where it's perceived to have a sort of high amount of illegal workers. So, for example, car washes, and you would have the sort of police raids on those types of businesses to find illegal workers.
Thank you very much.
Hello. So, first of all, whilst I'm glad you're inspired by Charlie Kirk with your tour, I'm glad it has a unique, like a British feel to it. It doesn't necessarily feel like you've just copied and pasted a model. So I do want to give praise to that. But also, with my question, you've spoken a lot about illegal migration. You've also spoken about legal migration in that economic context. Where do you stand on legal, well, not migrant, but British citizens who have perhaps culturally or ideologically corrosive views for society? Because when you look at the case with Shamima Begum, the state did kick in and say, that person has gone against our values, we are not letting them back in. But that's one case, and you don't have to necessarily join a terror organisation to be corrosive for society. So that is my question.
Yeah, and I think it's a debate that actually has been sort of raging for a while, and I think it's a difficult one. I think if you are a British citizen, whether that's because legally you gain citizenship or whether you have ancestry here, if you are, the example you used, Shamima Begum, if you're a terrorist, then I think it is a legitimate question to ask, well, you are not ascribing to what it means to be a British citizen, and should you remain so? So I know that, there's been a debate, especially within the sort of context of the 7/7 bombers recently, which is, are they British? How British is it to blow up tens of people? I think we all know the answer to that. So the question that you're asking, I think, is wider ranging. But in terms of terrorists, I think it's perfectly legitimate to take away citizenship from British citizens who are terrorists.
So do you think if you didn't go right to terrorists, do you think there's any scope before that something should be considered as a policy, or do you think that is perhaps too far in some way?
I think if you've committed a crime...
So not crime, but you espouse the views, but you know how to keep them within the law.
Well, again, that's entirely quite difficult to gauge and to organise and operate. Again, it would have to be a sort of case by case, I think, which is not sustainable for any bureaucracy, never mind the British bureaucracy. The question that you're asking, again, goes back to the wider debate, and I think it's a debate that will rage on for the next couple of years, probably for the next couple of decades, actually, just purely based on the mass migration that we've had, and you may see different solutions to it. I think it's quite difficult to answer now, just because we don't actually fully know the consequences of even the sort of last 5 years of migration. So it's definitely a debate that I think I will have many questions about over the next couple of months, and I think that will rage on for the next couple of years.
Thank you for your answer.
Hi, Jack. Well done for that. It's fantastic that you've taken the initiative to do this. My name's Guy Lachlan. I actually stood for reform in the general election in 24 in St Neots and Mid Cams before being kicked out of the party for having liked a tweet 3 years before I even joined reform. What we're seeing locally is that reform councillors, and I think nationally as well, reform councillors and people in positions of authority in the party are scared to speak up, because of the risk of, if you express what you think, you're liable to find yourself in the same position as me or Rupert Lowe or Ben Habib or countless others that have been slung out unceremoniously for disagreeing with the great leader. I just wondered how you feel about that in relation to your relationship with reform.
I back Nigel's decisions 100%. Which won't come as a surprise to you. I think the decisions that were taken were 100% reasonable and legitimate. I don't know your specific case.
Glad to show it to you.
I'm happy to speak after this, and you can share it with me, and I will see what I can do. But as for the other examples, I think actually what you've seen is that reform is only going up, and the other examples that you speak of, I think, are doing their own thing, which I wish them success with.
Yeah, we've had one defection in Cambridgeshire County Council already away from reform for the same reason, a sitting councillor. On the point you raised at the very beginning of your talk about people getting involved in politics and local politics especially, I'm absolutely with you on that. If anybody's interested, I'm doing a talk at the New Culture Forum, Cambridge branch, in March about how to get involved in local politics and make a difference from a right-wing perspective so that you can actually get your point across and get heard and make a difference locally. So we need more young people and more women especially. So please, come and see me afterwards or look it up online, NCF Locals. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I think Nigel's decision on Rupert Lowe is definitely the correct one in that respect.
Hi Jack, thanks for that.
Thank you.
The title is New Dawn, okay, and I'm clearly not a student, by the way. So in New Dawn, things are changing. I've sat at the front there looking at the banner saying Cambridge University Conservative Association 1921. So for over 120 odd years, that banner's been blue. So the question, not really for you, Jack, but for the audience is, when will that turn turquoise? When will you start talking out? Because I've heard reform mentioned 1,000 to 1 times conservative in this audience. Every single person is talking about reform. Even Guy, who's not a member of Reform anymore, is talking about reform. So we can all talk about it, but when's it going to happen? When are you guys going to set up a student society for Reform UK? So when I'm invited back next time as chairman of Reform UK Cambridge City, that I am, that is turquoise, not blue.
I think that's a question for you.
I personally have no interest in setting up a reform society. I think you'd have
How
to talk
dare you?
I think you'd have to talk to specific individuals if you wanted to do that, and not pose a question to the society as a whole. Thank you. Any further questions? No? Well, I think that brings us to a natural closing point. Thank you again, Jack.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. It's been a good speech and a good round of Q&A. So if everyone can just give Jack another round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.